Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming out on this beautiful November evening. I'm excited to present our speaker to you here in a second. But first of all, I want to thank everyone for being here this evening. I'd like to thank the Virginia Humanities for sponsoring our lecture series, also Lee Enterprise for being our exclusive media sponsor, and of course, the American Frontier Culture Foundation, who is just incredibly generous and supports the mission of the museum. And before we get started, one request, please, if you would please be so kind and complete a visitor survey at the end of the talk. I have a few lying at the table back there. There's also a spring schedule, because even though this is the last lecture in 2023, we've been working hard and planning the 2024 spring lecture series, and we already have 4 dates identified, and the topic for next year will be American History, Local History. What connects our community to the rest of the nation? We're still finalizing the speakers, but it's going to be very interesting talks, and I hope to see many of you here, especially our wonderful Mary Baldwin students. Thank you so much for coming out on a school night. We hope to see you here in the future as well. But without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Samantha Seely is an associate professor of history at the University of Richmond, where she specializes in 18th century North America and the early United States. She's the author of Race Removal and the Right to Remain, Migration and the Making of the United States, which was published in 2021 by the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture and the University of North Carolina Press. The book won the 2021 Merle Corti Prize and honorable mention for the James Rawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, as well as the 2021 John Gearde Prize from the Midwestern History Association. So please join me in welcoming Samantha Seely. Yeah.
Good evening. Can you all hear me all right with this microphone? Yep, fabulous. Welcome. Come on in. So thank you all so much for being here, and thank you especially to Doretta Sobolewski for organizing this talk as part of New Museum's ongoing lecture series. So one of the goals of this lecture series is, in part, to illuminate Virginia's early history. So I'm going to take a moment here at the outset to kind of situate us in place. My recent book, which I'll be speaking from tonight, this is the cover in case I'm inviting you to go and purchase it or read it from your local library if you'd like to. The book really touches upon Virginia history, and it thinks about the state as part of a broader region. So it roams through what I call the Middle States. And this was a region that was connected by migration in the 18th and the early 19th centuries. The Middle States is a term that I really picked up from this particular map that I'm showing here, that was part of a kind of popular almanac or geography published by the prominent Philadelphia publisher Matthew Carey in 1814. And this wasn't really a common term at the time. Kind of connecting this region under the banner of the Middle States wasn't necessarily super common, although it did appear in some other almanacs as well. All the same, I think that Carey's adoption of the term in this map makes a lot of sense, and his kind of grouping here makes a lot of sense. So I really ran with this in the book, and that's because grouping these states and territories together would have been really intuitive to people who were living in Matthew Carey's world in 1814, and here's why. These spaces were linked, first of all, by the Ohio River, which runs from Pittsburgh, what's now Pittsburgh, and you can see it kind of bordering the southern borders of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, all the way to the Mississippi River. And then these spaces were also linked in a kind of east-west route by the Great Valley Corridor along the Appalachians, which runs right through where we are now, and by many other kind of overland and coastal routes by the Chesapeake Bay. And so in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, people were basically constantly moving around this region, traveling by choice, by compulsion, by force, along these routes, linking these spaces on this map in a kind of steady stream of migration that was really striking to everyone at the time. So this is where I think Virginia kind of fits in this larger regional story if we're looking at the early 19th century. Actually, so many people were on the move in the late 18th and early 19th centuries that migration was really a kind of contest. It wasn't just something that people kind of took for granted as something that was natural or normal. It was something that everyone remarked upon and they fought about. So migration is a kind of contest or debate. I'm going to illustrate this, what I mean by this, by zooming in on one particular place and time. And we're going to start at Fort Pitt, which is circled here in red on this map, what's now Pittsburgh, in 1785. Fort Pitt was sited at the meeting point of three rivers, and especially at the kind of meeting point of the Ohio River, which was, as I mentioned, this kind of major artery through this region, for travel, for trade. And the area had long been a really important meeting place for Indigenous peoples. So when Fort Pitt was established during the 1750s, it was also a major site for imperial contestation between the British and the French, and actually the site of a kind of intercolonial rivalry between Virginia and Pennsylvania. So it was a really it was a central node in a really important region, just generally. Fort Pitt also had an important role in the American Revolution, too. So it was an anchor for Patriot wartime activity in western Pennsylvania. It was a key post for the Continental Army. It even hosted one of the very first international treaties that the new United States ever signed, the 1778 Treaty of Fort Pitt, between the Delaware leaders and U.S. negotiators. So in 1785, when our story begins, we are 2 years out from the end of the American Revolution in 1783, and this was a really long and difficult conflict between Britain and the U.S. and their allies over the future and autonomy of 13 of Britain's North American colonies. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and one of the most crucial provisions of that treaty was that Britain would hand over any claim to the lands between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains to the United States. When the revolution ended, hundreds of migrants from the East staked their own futures on that particular provision in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. And they began to pass through places like western Pennsylvania on their way to the rich farmlands of the Ohio Valley, so like what's now Ohio. They were joined by Virginia migrants who were traveling up through Kentucky or over through Kentucky. And then as a result, by 1785, Fort Pitt was really a kind of key command center for the new U.S. federal government as well, to monitor goings-on to the west, and particularly to monitor migrants who were passing through the region. So I've got another map for you here to kind of clarify this. This is a map that's contemporary to the period that I'm talking about. So you can see Pennsylvania as a state, but out to the west, Ohio is not yet a state in the 1780s in the period that I'm looking at, right? It's claimed by the United States as part of the Northwest Territory. I'm going to zoom in even further on just one single migrant who was kind of going through the region in 1785, a man named John Emerson. In 1785, John Emerson crossed the Ohio River from Fort Pitt, and when he got to the other side, he paused for a moment, and he pinned a handwritten manifesto that he had written to a tree. And that manifesto declared that, and I'm sorry the text is a little bit cut off, but I'll read this for you. It declared that all mankind agreeable to every constitution formed in America have an undoubted right to pass into any vacant country. An undoubted right to pass. And I think that's just such a revealing statement of the period. And I want to explain why by contextualizing it just a bit. So when Emerson traveled across the Ohio River, he went there actually against the orders of his own new government, which had prohibited American settlement in the region at the time. He didn't have an undoubted right to pass, according to Congress, in that particular moment. Federal officials were, in fact, really invested in keeping people like Emerson out of that area. they hoped to sell that whole region, what's now Ohio, to large speculators. And they wanted to use those funds to finance the new federal government, which was heavily in debt from the war. So in fact, federal officials were so invested in this idea that they sent out militias to destroy the cabins of unauthorized migrants so that they wouldn't return to that space again and again and again, although they did return again and again and again. So Emerson, I think, with this statement, was really putting forward his very own interpretation of what he thought the American Revolution had won in opposition to federal orders. He and lots of new Americans argued that free movement, what he called here in his big manifesto, the undoubted right to pass into any vacant country, they thought that was the kind of reward for what had been a long and difficult war. Free movement was the definition of the liberty that they had won. And like Emerson, thousands of people were taking to the roads after the Revolution. Western Pennsylvania was one kind of focal point for Eastern migrants in the 1780s who hoped to travel along that kind of Ohio River artery. And their movements show us, I think, that ultimately many white Eastern migrants measured the wages of war in the paths that they followed and the acres of land that they hoped to claim for themselves and their families. Okay, that's one thing that we could say. Historians for a long time took their cues from people like Emerson, from 18th century observers like Emerson, when they were trying to write the history of the post-revolutionary United States. They saw American migration as exceptional. They argued that free movement was vital to the American character. And that idea has really been with us, I think, since the beginnings of history as a kind of professional discipline itself in the late 19th century. So this first generation of professional university historians working in the late 19th century all agreed that the important story of the post-war decades was the movement of settlers to the frontier. Americans overall were kind of characterized by this spirit of immigration, a kind of mania for free movement, and that idea is still really with us in the kind of popular understandings of the period and the way that scholars often write and think about it. And I think that's absolutely true, that this is a really important part of the history of these first critical decades of the United States. But I would argue, and my book argues, that this is really only part of the story. And I want to tell a different kind of story about migration for the remainder of the time that I have tonight, because that free movement was very obviously also dependent upon the idea of removal. And that's the topic of my research and the topic that I want to address with the remainder of my time. So let's take a minute to flip Emerson's story around and look at it from a different angle. Let's look at his manifesto from a different kind of vantage point. You'll remember his phrase that all mankind have an undoubted right to pass into any vacant country. When Emerson went north of the Ohio River, he was not actually entering into vacant country at all. When Emerson went north of the Ohio River, he wasn't entering into U.S. territory either, although that's how the U.S. federal government wanted to see it. The new government claimed all of those lands east of the Mississippi River because Britain had handed over their claim to them in the Treaty of Paris. But in terms of actual power on the ground, like who controlled what happened in those spaces, Emerson was very clearly entering into native territory. So this is a map, obviously a kind of contemporary map here. He staked a spot on the lands of sovereign native peoples who had really complex and overlapping claims to that exact landscape. In 1783, 35 native nations of the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley had actually already formed their own confederation, just as the U.S. was confederating at the time. They were also confederating to protect exactly those lands in the Ohio country, like what's now Ohio, from expropriation by people like Emerson. Their goal was to maintain the Ohio River, again, kind of along the bottom of this map, like running right along the bottom, as a firm boundary between their country and U.S. settlements. So like anything north of the Ohio River, they wanted to maintain as native space. From the perspective of native peoples already living in that place, Emerson's claim was part of this much larger project of removal that was being waged by individuals, as well as the states and the federal government in the post-revolutionary years. Okay, so in fact, while free movement has been this kind of defining story that many people tell about the post-revolutionary era, if we flip that story around, it's clear that removal was just as important. In the early decades of the new United States, legislators and leaders and reformers and intellectuals and ordinary people were all pitching removal as a kind of solution to many of the major problems and debates that had been created by the American Revolution. So debates left behind by the war about political disaffection, what to do with people who didn't agree, land hunger, war debts, the limits of slavery and emancipation, the meaning of citizenship in the new nation. And in the midst of all of these debates, people were kind of pitching this pernicious idea that some people belonged in the United States and other people should be physically removed from it, from its bounds, removal. When we hear that term removal, I think in the context of US history, for many people, their minds automatically go to the antebellum era, to the 1830s. And that's for good reason, because amid Georgia's fight to dispossess the Cherokees, the 1830 Indian Removal Act made the removal of Eastern Native peoples beyond the Mississippi River into federal policy. And that eventually led to the infamous Cherokee Trail of Tears in 1838. And then there was this kind of contemporaneous movement that brought together an alliance of Upper South, and particularly Virginia slaveholders, and Northern reformers, who founded the American Colonization Society in 1816. And the ACS, or American Colonization Society, was created to send free African Americans outside of the nation to a free black colony on the west coast of Africa that they called Liberia. And that organization was also very popular in the 1820s forward. And putting those two things together means that when people hear the word removal in the context of US history, they often jump right to the 1820s or the 1830s and the antebellum period, particularly because of Indian removal. So in a typical kind of US history high school textbook, removal appears as this single moment that happened around the 1830s. But I think that removal has roots much earlier than that, because decades before that moment in the 1830s, lots of people were proposing things like restrictive migration statutes that controlled where people could move, removal treaties with Indigenous peoples, colonization schemes, planned buffer states. And those more kind of scattered precursors served as the testing ground for later removal projects, things like the Indian Removal Act, that have a much larger profile in US history and memory. In fact, removal was surprisingly commonplace as a kind of tool of state-making after the American Revolution. We have to remember that the post-revolutionary world felt so uncertain to early Americans. They had inherited a pretty weak federal government from the war, an experimental republic, and no one knew what its fate might be. And as they grappled with that uncertainty over the kind of nation that they had created, many people with power were united in their desire to solve contentious debates through the idea of removal. And then, like John Emerson, other people just assumed that it was a given or a necessity. They took it for granted. Ultimately, removal was really part of the fabric of the nation from its beginnings in the post-revolutionary period. And in fact, later projects, like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, could only have proceeded so rapidly, have had such devastating effects like the Trail of Tears, because these ideas had been tested and tried for decades beforehand. But I want to pause here for a moment and kind of take a step back, because this isn't to say that removal sprang up out of nowhere. It wasn't actually unique to the United States, so there are many kind of parallels to be drawn from the time period. Its proponents, for example, could look to the wider British Empire and the British colonial past for models. For a lot of 17th century monarchs and their ministers, they believed that the forced transportation of large groups of people to new places would reform convicts, suppress rebellion, alleviate poverty. And so just a couple of examples: criminal transportation, so the kind of deportation of people who had been convicted of crimes to the North American colonies, or the way that Britain targeted what people they considered to be enemies within. So a good example here is the 6,000 French-speaking Acadians who were living in the Canadian Maritime provinces who were exiled by British forces in 1755 in the midst of war with the French. Removal was also the British Empire's kind of persistent answer to a lot of social and political problems in the 18th century. Still, I think what's different here is that removal kind of caught on with this strength and speed in the late 18th century US that was a little bit unique. Removal was uniquely important to the post-revolutionary moment, as early Americans tried to kind of construct the nation by determining and defining its people, its territory, its jurisdiction for the first time in, as I mentioned, this kind of period of real uncertainty about what kind of country they had founded. And the big question that they were asking was, who should be part of the new nation? And after 1783, they continuously turned to removal to answer that question. And as they did so, they trained their eyes most consistently on Indigenous people and African Americans. So, first let me kind of consider here the post-revolutionary roots of Indian removal and trace that genealogy back just a little bit. So when federal officials pushed for the removal of Indigenous people, they did so in this period because of the high value that they were placing on the land of sovereign Native people. Indigenous people were excluded from the peace agreement that had ended the American Revolution in 1783, and that was a real shock to many Indigenous leaders who had fought alongside both Britain and the United States during the war. They had been crucial, sought-after allies during that conflict on both sides. After the war, the U.S. basically used that exclusion from the Treaty of Paris to argue that they had won Native lands by conquest, right? Because Native leaders hadn't been part of the peace, that they had won all of their lands by conquest. And they tried to kind of negotiate this series of coercive treaties in the 1780s where they were claiming thousands and thousands of acres of land based on this kind of argument that they had won land by conquest. And Native peoples were really kind of dismayed by this because they had fought in the war, but they hadn't been part of the war's conclusion. In the 1780s, federal officials were reimagining Native lands in the West as what they called, and this is a term from the period, a fund to pay for the Revolutionary War debts of the new nation. So we can see this in two ways. The first that I've already mentioned, where legislators were really anxious to pay both their domestic and foreign creditors from the war. The Articles of Confederation, the kind of like governing structure of the new United States, didn't allow them to tax people directly. And so the way that they imagined kind of raising revenue to pay off a lot of those debts was through land sales. And they imagined that they would sell native lands to private speculators first, who would then take care of the kind of distribution of lands to individual buyers. So this map is a really good example of that. Maybe some of you have seen this before, but Manasseh Cutler was part of a large group of speculators who were kind of speculating in Ohio country lands. And so this is part of the southern part of Ohio, and here you can see Cutler publishes this map, imagining kind of chopping up those lands into these neat townships that then can be parceled off for sale. So a really good example here of what speculation would look like in the 1780s. And then another example of the way that these lands, that indigenous lands, were part of this idea of a fund to pay for the new government, or revolutionary kind of inheritance, is that veterans had also been promised land bounties, many of them in the Ohio country, and they had been promised native land basically as compensation for military service. So the states had offered land bounties as a way to kind of get people to enlist during the war when enlistments were flagging. So for a lot of people, they also saw these lands as kind of part of their inheritance from the war and what they were owed from the war. Okay, so that's one way of looking at this. We might also think about gradual emancipation. So for, or emancipation as well. So for African Americans, removal was also tied up in the consequences of the American Revolution. The war had opened a lot of pathways to freedom for some African Americans, as some states embraced gradual emancipation. So here on this map, I've kind of circled those in red so that you can see Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey. They all passed these gradual emancipation statutes that said that people would become free after a certain term of years. And then other states began to emancipate people through their state constitutions and through court cases. So I don't actually like the dates up here for Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts because the process was much more kind of drawn out than those dates suggest, but in roughly that time period, this is when you start to see like kind of court challenges to slavery in those places where people were bringing freedom suits and kind of freeing themselves in court. And that started the kind of downfall and dissipation of slavery in those northern states. So all of these states are legislating or kind of working towards emancipation in some way in this time period. So these pathways to freedom were kind of opening up in this time period. But just as some of those pathways to freedom opened up, a lot of doorways to equality were swinging shut at the same exact time. Lots of people at the time argued that slavery should end, but that it should be accompanied by removal. They said that enslaved people should be freed gradually and sent beyond the boundaries of the nation to form a separate colony. And they called this colonization. Colonization plans were a relatively standard part, actually, of anti-slavery discourse in this time period in the US. Colonization as an idea was popping up in this time period in pamphlets and newspaper articles, in private letters, in parlor conversations, and the most vocal proponents of colonization were certainly Virginia slaveholders, who supported this idea because they thought that emancipation and free African Americans would either challenge slavery or challenge the kind of racial order of their state at the time. A great example of one of these Virginia colonizationists was St. George Tucker, and perhaps some of you know St. George Tucker as well, who wrote this plan up for the gradual abolition of slavery in Virginia in 1796, and it included a colonization plan. So people would be emancipated, and then they would be sent beyond the state. They would be removed from the state as a result of their emancipation. He presented this plan to the Virginia state legislature, and it was tabled and kind of ignored immediately. So people really shut him down. But nonetheless, Tucker and many of his colleagues were talking about these plans at the time. Even in the 1790s, they were kind of discussing colonization and abolition in Virginia and what that would look like. Mid-Atlantic Quakers also thought, it wasn't just Virginians, Mid-Atlantic Quakers also thought that colonization might put an end to slaveholding. And at the same time, Black Northern proponents also believed that an immigration scheme that they controlled themselves could deliver independence or economic prosperity at a moment when both were really uncertain because of racism. So there were obviously really different ideas behind all of these plans, but actually a lot of their proponents were in conversation with each other and had read what each other was writing about these ideas. Okay. So in both cases, for both Indigenous people and for African Americans, removal proposals were this way of working out who belonged in the new nation. Because removal was so commonplace, as I hope I have demonstrated thus far, so commonplace at this time, African Americans and Indigenous communities also staunchly protected their right to remain in their homes and their homelands. So for lots of people, the kind of defining story of the early national period was not just free movement, but actually also their fight to stay in place. And so I think that putting removal at the kind of center of the story reveals this other significant and under-examined current in American life, which is the right to remain. So what if we thought about the kind of defining story of the early United States not as one of free migration, but as a story about the pursuit for the right to remain? And I think that also changes how we see one of the questions that the museum here, as I understand it, is very concerned with, which is how did many different groups of people contribute to American culture, to democracy, to political life? And I think that the right to remain is a kind of under-examined thread here too. So I'm going to illustrate that point about the right to remain by telling two different stories. For the first, let's kind of circle back here to where we started, back to the Ohio country, back to John Emerson's manifesto about vacant land that he had pinned to a tree. So for Native people in the region, Emerson's statement was jarring because it effectively erased their presence. Some of them were already refugees of colonial dispossession. Fraudulent land purposes had displaced the Delawares already from eastern Pennsylvania into Ohio by the 1750s, and they were joined by Shawnees who had been displaced once from their Ohio Valley lands, went to many different places, among them Pennsylvania, and then many of those people actually returned at the same time as the Delawares. And so the Shawnee returnees and Delawares were making new towns alongside Native Westerners like the Miamis, Odawas, Potawatomis, and Wyandots. By the 1780s, in the Ohio country, a lot of native towns were actually kind of composite towns made up of many different peoples. And a lot of scholars have argued that those kind of composite towns also encouraged Indigenous people to join together in defense of their right to remain in that time period. They ended up forming this loose confederation that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. And in a lot of documents, that confederation is identified as the United Indian Nations. By 1786, that confederation had developed a really clear platform of dissent against removal. And they ended up critiquing the kind of core tenets of U.S. post-war policy towards Indigenous people. Those core tenets included the idea that the U.S. had won native lands by conquest after the American Revolution, and mostly the idea that as sovereign people, they would choose to sell any of their lands at all to anyone. And their opposition to U.S. policy was summarized by the Shawnee leader, Captain Johnny, who told federal representatives that, in his words at the time, God gave us this country. We do not understand measuring out the lands. It's all ours. So confederating gave people power in this region. The United Indian Nations ended up fighting a multi-decade war with the United States to preserve their sovereignty and their borders in the Ohio country. And their resistance was so effective that it actually consumed the majority of the federal budget of the United States between 1790 and 1796. One of the most powerful moments, I think, in that long war for the Ohio Valley is when the U.S. finally sent negotiators to meet with the Confederation's leaders in Detroit to try to purchase the lands instead of taking them by conquest. Shawnee and Miami leaders who were kind of at the forefront of the Confederacy at the time just flat out refused to negotiate at all, even for purchase. They refused to sell. And two Wyandotte emissaries at the time kind of brought that message to U.S. federal negotiators who were waiting in Detroit in 1793. This is what Detroit looked like at the time. I just love this painting. I think it's so beautiful and shows you how Detroit was this kind of what one scholar has called a frontier seaport in this time period. So these emissaries arrive in Detroit, and on opening up the meeting with U.S. negotiators, they announced that they had no use at all for the money that the U.S. officials were offering, and instead they suggested that the U.S. use it to buy out, quote unquote, their own people who had settled on native lands without any authorization from them. And that exchange was recorded in the journals of many observers who found it really striking. One of them was the Philadelphia Quaker, John Parrish. Quakers were attending treaties a lot in this time period as the kind of emissaries of peace, so they were often at these treaties observing the speeches and writing them down. And Parrish called this speech, quote unquote, mortifying to the commissioners. And he wasn't the only one who found it mortifying. What was really interesting to me is that ultimately Native resistance led to actually a lot of hand-wringing in Congress at the time and in the Eastern press, in newspapers, about removal policies. Some leaders even began to kind of question the morality and the practicality of taking Native lands by conquest. Over the next several decades, Indigenous people in the region fought for the right to remain in a number of ways. They advocated these clear, kind of marked borders that would set off their lands as their own. They arranged for good neighbors to stay close by for protection. So Delawares and Senecas, for example, were settling on Miami and Wyandotte lands to kind of act as buffers between themselves and U.S. military campaigns and settlement. And when Native diplomats also kind of reached in all directions in this time period. So they were making connections and alliances with Anishinaabe and British diplomats. They were reaching south to the Creeks and the Cherokees, kind of trying to further confederate and make alliances to bolster their own power in the region. Why does this long struggle for the right to remain matter? Well, to put it simply, removal was not inevitable. When we kind of view this backwards from the 1830s or even later in the 19th century, it can look inevitable, but that is not the case at all. Viewed from the desks of removal's most ardent proponents, sometimes removal looks inevitable in this period. It looks totalizing, but that's a really partial vision. In reality, a lot of these plans didn't work how people thought they might, and as Native people fought for their right to remain, their struggle became part of a much kind of longer and more enduring fight to show Native persistence in this region. So that's the first story about the right to remain. And I want to tell a second story here about the right to remain before I conclude. We can see these battles over the right to remain in so many places, but I'm just going to land on one tonight. And we're going to go back to Virginia, and we're going to return to our local story. And this time we're going to pause for a minute in Richmond in 1811. So in 1811, a free African-American man named Adam Barber walked up the kind of steep embankment that you see here, all the way over to the Virginia Capitol building. I don't know if you can see it in the back there, but kind of like looming over the whole city, really different skyline than we have today. This is looking across the James River towards the Capitol. And so this is an early 19th century illustration of Richmond. And Barber walked in up to the Capitol building to see if he could find out the result of a petition that he had submitted to the Virginia state legislature. Over the course of his lifetime, someone like Barber would have seen firsthand how the American Revolution had changed the conversation about slavery and freedom in the new nation. Virginia was the largest slave state in the new nation. 40% of the state's population was enslaved. But during the American Revolution, thousands of people had also freed themselves by taking up British offers of freedom and running to British lines during the war. They had purchased their freedom, and they had also become free through manumission, which was the emancipation of individual people by slaveholders. That's what manumission is. The state didn't legislate gradual emancipation. If you remember my map from before, the state didn't legislate gradual emancipation like many of the northern and mid-Atlantic states did, but they did liberalize their manumission laws, just like Delaware and Maryland also did at the time. Meaning, before 1782, slaveholders had to submit a special petition to be able to emancipate a single individual. After 1782, the legislature made it much easier to do that. It made it possible for slaveholders basically to free people without seeking special permission. And so as a result, by 1800, about 20,000 free black Virginians were living as free people in the state. But the kind of expansion of black freedom in Virginia in those first decades after the American Revolution also eventually led to a kind of backlash in the halls of the state legislature. In 1806, the legislature passed a law that exiled free African Americans from the state. So it required people to leave within a year of becoming free. Within a year of emancipation, they had to leave the state. The 1806 law was an attempt to discourage emancipation and to limit black freedom by forcing free men and women to settle elsewhere outside of Virginia. It was essentially a kind of state-level removal law. It was colonization, but put into practice at the state level. So Barber himself, Adam Barber, to return to his story, had become free after the passage of that law, so he was impacted by it. When he became free, he was supposed to leave the state. He was supposed to be exiled under this law. He only had one mode of recourse in the law, which was that if he wanted to stay in his home, he could submit a special petition, an individual petition to the state legislature for the right to remain. And so he ended up joining hundreds of free black Virginians in petitioning the state legislature for permission to stay in the state. Barber likely would have worked with a white lawyer at the time to make his case and to write his petition. And if you read all of these documents, these petitions that people were writing next to each other, they are really affecting testaments to the meaning of home and family and community and neighborhood. In his petition, Barber ended up, for example, explaining that freedom would be, quote unquote, deprived of its greatest pleasure without his right to remain with his wife and children, who were still enslaved. And this is the case for many people, that actually people were forming families across the boundaries of slavery and freedom. So to be exiled meant to leave your family. Barber asked the state legislature to think about, quote unquote, social feelings when they judged his case. And then to support his cause, you can see on the second and third pages of this petition, he tracked down the signatures of, dozens of his friends and neighbors who would sign his petition saying that he deserved to stay. And I think that just kind of attests to the gravity of the law's effect on his family. So Barber's story, this threat of removal, actually didn't stop just at Virginia's borders. This isn't just a Virginia story. As governors and state legislatures in neighboring states caught wind of this law, they also made it harder for free African Americans to settle in their states too. So we can return to my map of the middle states here. Within just a few years, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, they had all passed similar restrictive migration laws that made it harder for free African Americans to cross state borders. Many African Americans at the time saw Pennsylvania as a kind of refuge against slavery. It had a large Quaker community, a large white abolitionist and black abolitionist community that often worked together to make it a kind of safe haven for people leaving slavery. But even in Pennsylvania, legislators debated various measures to exclude black migrants from the state. So my point here is that colonization ideas were just kind of one part of a broader assault against the ability for African Americans to remain in place in this time period. From restricting migration, as all of these middle states did in some way or tried to do in some way, to requiring free African Americans to carry free papers. So in Virginia, for example, free African Americans actually were supposed to register with the county whenever they moved, even within the state. Those people who moved into new areas and couldn't produce evidence of their freedom could be arrested and jailed, and they would have to be indentured out to pay for their jail fees. And these laws certainly kind of cast the long shadow of slavery even over into free life for many people. But beyond these kind of punitive state laws, the expansion of the domestic slave trade, the trade in enslaved people between different states in the 1790s also led to an epidemic of kidnapping, so forcing free people back into bondage illegally. And scholars have recently uncovered the extent to which, like, the Chesapeake Bay region was kind of this hotspot for kidnapping in the time period, as people were kidnapped from Pennsylvania into slavery in the Upper South. So as a result, a lot of black leaders in this time period in the United States highlighted the right of free people to remain as one of the most important political crises of their time. And they were writing pamphlets about all of these things and kind of protesting in many different ways, petitioning Congress, suing for the freedom of different individuals in court. One example is James Forten, the prominent businessman in Philadelphia and sailmaker, who wrote a really wonderful pamphlet called Letters from a Man of Color, where he's kind of arguing against these restrictive migration laws. So I want to conclude here by moving forward in time, because increasingly these parallel stories were becoming entangled. By 1830, removal was reaching a fever pitch. It was much more rapid, both in terms of Indian removal and colonization. And there were these kind of persistent stories and proposals for exclusion, like the rise of Jacksonian Indian removal, colonization. Because of these things, anti-removal activists began to see Native American and African American experiences as really linked. So activists were petitioning, they were lobbying, they were holding public meetings about these proposals. And as a result, by the 1830s, they began to see removal as one story, not as separate stories. African American activists, for example, at anti-colonization conventions called the Cherokee struggle against removal and their own fight one and the same. They literally said this. The Indigenous writer, Pequot writer, William Apess identified the treatment of Native Americans and African Americans as the kind of two founding sins of the United States. And so they all began to argue that this was kind of uniquely important thing to protest. So I'm going to end with the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who I think is a great example of this kind of entangled thinking. And he wrote in his 1832 pamphlet, excoriating the American Colonization Society, and Indian removal, he asked his readers to picture what he called a philanthropic arithmetician kind of carrying his slate and pencil. And he wrote, "In 15 minutes, they will clear the continent of every black skin, and if desired, throw in the Indians to boot." This was, Garrison suggested, the surpassing utility of arithmetic. And so I find this figure of the philanthropic arithmetician, someone who's kind of hubristically imagining moving people outside the nation, to be a really powerful symbol. The arithmetician was imagining people as kind of populations to be removed with a wave of a hand. And I think that sort of arithmetic wasn't just apparent in 1832 in Garrison's time, but also decades beforehand, when people were really making calculations about belonging, about citizenship in the new nation. Removal wasn't this kind of anomalous project of a later period, but it was a process. It wasn't a moment, and it had its roots in those first kind of critical decades after the American Revolution. And then ultimately, I just want to end by saying that I don't think this is just a story about exclusion either. It's also a story about the many, many people who worked hard to secure the right to remain, both ordinary people working in their local communities and well-known activists like James Forten, who had a kind of national and even international stage to work on. In the process, I think they ended up putting that struggle for the right to remain right at the heart of American democracy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this talk.
If you share our passion for early American history and would like to support free programs like this, please consider making a donation to the American Frontier Culture Foundation at frontierculturefoundation.org. Thank you for your support, and we hope to see you in person at the Frontier Culture Museum in Stanton, Virginia.